So this is our final video on efficiency. And even though it looks like there's a ton to talk about in this video, I swear I'm gonna try and keep it relatively brief. So first we're gonna talk about what happens at P star and Q star. The market equilibrium that we're thinking about is where everyone charges the same price and the maximum amount of trades take place at that price. One of the parts of this efficiency is called allocative efficiency, meaning who gets it, what's the allocation like. And at the market equilibrium, the people who value the good the most are the ones who receive it. So think back to our Ararat market. We had that person that was willing to pay like $1,200, $1,500, and the person that was willing to pay $500, $600, those big sneaker rats who thought they could make a lot of profit or who were just huge Kanye West fans, they were the ones who ended up in the market buying the sneakers. And somewhat simultaneously, we have what we call productive efficiency. Productive efficiency is about who produces. And at the market equilibrium of P star, Q star, the producers who can produce the good for the cheapest are the ones who will supply it. So thinking back to our sneaker example, the $50 producer and the $200 producer were the ones who ended up making the trades, right? Somehow gotten paired up with those two on eBay. And they're the ones with the lowest opportunity cost of hanging on to the sneakers. They were either clueless or they just didn't fit them anymore. They needed to pay their rent. And that's why they ended up in the market. So there are really good parts about that. One thing to note though, is that for most typical supply transactions, we're not talking about people flipping a good. In many markets, people are actually making the good for the first time. And in that situation, what's something that would make your sneaker have a really low cost, a really low willingness to sell, is if you had really poorly paid workers, or if you had very cheap materials, or if you had very bad environmental standards. So one of the things that can put suppliers down here is pretty bad business practices. So I want you to keep that in mind and then other things. So just think through a little bit on your own. What are the pros and cons of this market equilibrium, of this P star, Q star that we've been talking so much about? What do you appreciate about allocative and productive efficiency? And are there any outcomes that would be more fair? Are there any potential downsides to allocating goods this way? So if the good were not something like an Ararat sneaker, but if the good were the amount of, if the good were college tuition, or if the good were something like bread or rice or the staples of what you need to eat. Think about, just pause, reflect on that in a little bit in your quiz. How do you weigh the pros and cons of assigning goods this way through the market economy? Okay, so I look forward to reading through your thoughtful words there. These are not the right version of the slides. Sorry about that. For some reason, I didn't have the most recent version of the slides on my tablet. So after you've done that quiz, I want to get kind of your raw, unfiltered, through my lens thoughts. I think of this as kind of the trade-off between efficiency versus equity. And this is one of the things that is in the learning goals for this class for a reason. I remember the first time I learned economics was in a high school class, and I was just entranced. I was like, ah, I love efficiency. My whole life I've loved efficiency. I love doing 10 things at once and figuring out the optimal way to get them all done so that I save time. I love maximizing the space in my kitchen, like all kinds of weird ways that I love efficiency. Like there's nothing the utility company can do that gets me more excited when they send me a little thing that says you are more efficient than 95% of your neighbors. They just know the way to make cold hard economists hard. So I love efficiency. I love it, but it has its downsides. And so throughout this class, I'm going to ask you to think about policy and weigh the efficiency versus equity trade-offs. And so before we can do that, we kind of need to define efficiency a little bit more. So I think of efficiency as it's the outcome that maximizes producer and consumer surplus. It's sometimes P star, Q star, right? The market equilibrium. Although when we get to externalities after the second exam, we'll show that actually the market gets it wrong. But for now, we can think of it as the market equilibrium is the one that makes producer and consumer surplus as big as it possibly can be. If we have our demand and supply, we know we've got consumer surplus and producer surplus. Anywhere except P star, Q star is going to chop off a little bit of producer and consumer surplus. Right? If we restrict the quantity to be here, we'll lose that red chunk. If we make people trade more than they want to, we'll get a different kind of inefficiency, which is these excess trades where the cost exceeds what consumers are willing to pay down on the demand curve. You can think of the supply curve as always telling you a bunch of different willingness to sells, and demand is telling you a bunch of different willingness to pays. If we make people trade out here, they're trading where the willingness to sell or the cost is more than the willingness to pay, and that's not efficient either. I've got some policies that push us up there. The place that makes consumer and producer surplus as big as they possibly can be, that triangle, is only at this magic black hole spot of P star, Q star. But we want to constantly be thinking about equity as well. So economists like to talk of this as income inequality or inequality in the distribution of resources. So I think of defining equity as the outcome that distributes that consumer and producer surplus fairly. But fair can mean a lot of different things to different people. So how should we think of fair? I think there's a lot of ways we could define that. We could think of it as one that brings us closer to an equal distribution of that surplus. So it's not just the person who's willing to pay $1,500 that gets the good, but there's somebody who's only willing to pay 10 because they don't have the money. And we think of a way to get them each what they need. Could be an outcome that corrects historical injustices, an outcome that ensures the most vulnerable consumers are going to receive some of the product. That might be fair. It could be an anti-racist outcome that tries to correct the distribution of wealth in America. It could be an outcome that makes sure producers do not have an incentive to cut corners on environmental or labor standards. If it's the lowest cost producers that wind up in the market, how can we make sure that their costs are low because they're efficient and not because they are dirty in an environmental way or not good to their workers? Okay, so that's kind of a philosophical thing to be thinking about constantly as we weigh outcomes, and economists do have a lot to say about it. Let's think about elasticity and what that means. So going back to our last module on elasticity, what does that mean for our current module on producer and consumer surplus? So I think it's best shown with an example. So thinking about steepness and flatness of demand and supply curves. Draw the market for electric vehicles while considering the elasticity of demand and supply. I think the demand for electric vehicles is going to be pretty elastic. These are a big chunk of your budget, right? So for that reason, consumers are going to be pretty price sensitive. There's also currently quite a few substitutes, although for some consumers, there is no substitute to an electric vehicle. I'd say for the average person buying a car, they will buy it if the price is right or if the savings on fuel are right or if there's enough of a subsidy. But for the most part, people don't think of them as necessities yet. So the demand is going to be pretty elastic, I'm going to say. I wouldn't necessarily call them like luxury, but maybe. If we pay attention to what's happening on the West Coast right now, we know climate change is actually not about future generations anymore, it's about us. So in that way, they're not really a luxury, but people tend to act like they are. So they're a large chunk of your budget and not a necessity. If the government required everyone to have a more fuel efficient vehicle, then maybe the demand would become more inelastic. And then when we think about supply, remember we're not thinking about substitutes, we're thinking about how flexible is the production, how easy is it to ramp up and ramp down. And if you paid attention to what's happened with Tesla's backlog, you can see that the production has not historically been super flexible. I think the supply is pretty inelastic. There's a lot of specialty parts that could only be used on an electric vehicle. So if the price goes way down, they can't cut back on their supply very easily because they have all these parts that are only good at making electric vehicles. And they are made on assembly lines, but those assembly lines have like a 5-year plan that's hard to adjust. You could argue different things. As long as you argue in line with our assumptions and it seems reasonable, you'd probably get the points. So what that means, notice that the steeper supply is, the higher the price is going to be, right? When producers are inflexible, they have more bargaining power and they're going to be able to kind of jack up the price. Another way of thinking of that is if you want an inflexible producer to produce you a good, you better offer them a lot because they're not very responsive to price. So you have to really offer them a lot of money for them to produce a lot of vehicles. So that's why electric vehicles can cost like 50,000, maybe 100,000, depending on the model, and why the quantity is relatively low. Maybe we can think of this as the people in our class that have one, and maybe there's only 5 in our class that have one. This is also the reason why consumer and producer surplus are the size that they are. So think about consumer surplus. It's the area below the demand curve because demand is willingness to pay and above price. So it's this blue triangle right here. And consumer surplus is going to be small. The more price sensitive consumers are, the lower their max they're willing to pay and the smaller consumer surplus is. Think about rotating that demand curve down, shrinks consumer surplus even more. Because producers are inflexible, they have this willingness to sell that's not easy for them to change, and they're being offered a price that's way above that to get them to produce more. The producer surplus is large. Right? So for something like an electric vehicle with all these specialty inputs, it's hard to get you to produce more. You get more of the benefit from the market to incentivize you to produce. So consumer surplus is less than, I was just teaching my son about the carrots and the monster gobbling the thing, trying to do some homeschool math, but I did it the wrong way. Consumer surplus is less than producer surplus. So pause here, and as a quiz, I want you to think of a product that will have the opposite elasticities. So one where demand would be really inelastic and supply will be really elastic. And consumers would get the majority of the surplus in that case. So here's what the graph for that would look like. Demand would be really steep and supply would be really flat. And that means consumers get a ton of benefit because they're willing to pay almost anything, and producers get very little because it's so easy for them to ramp up production. They don't need to be offered a big carrot. So try and think of a product. What product should we put here? And I'll share the best ones in class. Okay. So we're at the 15-minute mark, so I'm just going to quickly talk to you about deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is going to become much more important in the next module when we start talking about policies that cause it. I think of deadweight loss as consumer or producer surplus that exists at the market equilibrium and is destroyed by moving to a different outcome. So I showed you it in a graph recently. And this is usually foregone mutually beneficial transactions. So let's say we're thinking about our old friend, the Ararat sneaker. And remember that demand started at like 5,000. Supply started at 20. That was the supply choke price and the demand choke price. Q star was 10,000 and P star was 250. Although we don't actually need that information right now. What happens if the government bans the sneaker resale market? So let's say somebody gets coronavirus from buying a pair of Ararats online because there's so many surfaces you have to sanitize, and it turns out the virus loves space age looking moon sneakers. All of this consumer surplus and all of this producer surplus are going to be destroyed. The quantity will be set to 0. Right? It's like supply starts to look like this vertical line at this quantity of 0. It's perfectly inelastic at 0. Probably a black market that will develop, but assuming they're able to successfully ban it, this whole triangle, this red triangle, becomes deadweight loss. Those are all the mutually beneficial transactions that go away, all of the well-being that goes away. And that triangle can be measured by 1/2 base times height. So 1/2 times the 10,000 base times the height of 5,000 minus 20. So that's 5,000 times 4980, which is 24,900,000, which should also, if you go back to videos 1 and 2, just be equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus that we calculated. So in an extreme example, when you ban a market, the whole thing becomes dead weight loss. Many markets are missing, maybe because they were banned. We're going to think of missing markets as the ones that would create mutually beneficial transactions. There's buyers who'd love to buy, sellers who'd love to sell, but the market does not exist. And the absence of those markets is going to create dead weight loss. So I want you to pause for a second, and as a quiz, think of some missing markets. Is there something you've tried to buy recently where you just couldn't find it? I told you I was, there's a secret island in the middle of Lake St. George, or pretty much right off the coast of the state park, and I want to find the market for the property rights to that island, but it's apparently missing. Okay, so hopefully you thought of some good markets that are missing. Here's 3 common reasons that a market would be missing. The government could ban it, or they could tax it so much that it's like taxed out of existence. An example of this would be in the US, it's illegal to buy and sell kidneys, right? One of the reasons the government bans that is they believe that if you could earn money from selling a kidney, maybe there'd be all these people kind of abducting people and stealing their organs. So sell them on the market. Another reason that a market could be missing is because of lack of information communication, right? When there's not full information, how do you know that somebody is there who wants to supply it to you? So many markets were had a lot less completion, were more likely to be missing before the internet, right? So now that we have things like Craigslist or Poshmark, the market for used clothes, the market for lots of crazy things you can buy and sell on Craigslist. Those markets are not missing anymore because now you can tell people what you're willing to do for money on Craigslist, and people can buy and sell that information and buy and sell those products. And a similar one, I guess, is lack of technology. So pre-eBay, all we had was garage sales. And now that eBay's there, there's much more of a market. The market is much larger. It's not missing anymore for all of the buyers that would want to buy your used space sneakers. So I'd say 2 and 3 are pretty related because most of the technology we have now is about sharing information. So last thing for this video is just to pause and take the quiz. This is an example of a multiple choice question from an old exam, and hopefully it's relatively straightforward. Thanks all. I'll see you in class on Monday where we'll do some more examples.